Kazuro, hearing that no one would let him go and that he had little chance against such a crowd, began to gradually retreat back. The long-haired monster took out his dagger and pointed it at Kajuro, ordering his monsters to attack. The monsters rushed to attack, and one of the monsters, using its sharp claws, extended its hand and wanted to cut the boy. The rest of the monsters were also ready to grab Kajuro's body and tear it apart. Bent down on Kazuro and was ready to cut the guy, but an unexpected blow from the shadows cuts off the monster's head and kills him. The rest of the monsters did not understand what happened and stopped. Suddenly, a monster appears in front of Kajuro and saves him from the attack. Kajuro is happy that he was saved and does not understand why the monster helped him. He was big and strong with a huge cleaver, with which he cut off the monster's head. Kajuro recognizes this cleaver and understands that this is the monster who was supposed to marry the monster's bride, and he replaced him and saved him from family life. Kajuro felt awkward and asked how he knew he was in trouble and where he was. A monster with a cleaver points his finger at a crowd of monsters led by a monster bride. She gathered her best warriors to save you. Kajuro was surprised that the one he doesn't reciprocate was trying so hard and trying to save him. Having led her army to the center of the old forest, with a loud cry, she directed her monsters to kill the enemy and bring the long-haired monster to her. She was very serious, and the desire to save her lover was very great. Monsters on both sides rushed to the attack, killing each other and fighting for their leader. They were brave and fearless in using their abilities. The entire forest was covered in loud screams and the noise of battle. In battle, the monsters showed all their abilities trying to defeat their leader and survive. One of the monsters had the power to kill an enemy with one blow. Other monsters were capable of vomiting acid and disintegrating their opponents. Each side had its own strong warriors, but no one could compare in strength with the leaders of the long-haired monster and the monster bride. Kazuro looked at the big battle and was amazed at the number of monsters who fought using their skills and head, rather than running away mindlessly. Such a sight drew you in and made you not look away. In the heat of battle, the bride sees Kajuro standing to the side and runs up to hug him and make sure that he is safe and healthy. She was glad that he was as beautiful and healthy as when they first met. She hugged the guy to her and looked with a loving gaze, a little embarrassed and showing it through the redness on her cheeks. Kazuro looked at her and saw a beautiful girl with attractive shapes and a gentle voice, but everything was spoiled by the fact that she was a monster. While Kajuro was hugging his bride, the long-haired monster fought off the attacks of the bride's warriors. He used strong magical skills and scattered the warriors in all directions. The bride notices that the long-haired monster wants to attack them and covers her groom behind him. She prepares to fight that monster and asks Kajuro not to interfere in the fight. She loves Kajuro too much to risk him. Kazuro, hearing such words, begins to wonder whether it is possible to live together with a monster. The monster bride, using her magic, decides to attack the long-haired monster with sharp poisonous darts. Using her magic and abilities that are on par with her opponent, she attacks him. The darts fly into the crowd of monsters and hit almost everyone who was there. The long-haired monster manages to jump away and avoid being hit by such a powerful attack. When a dart hits the monster's body, they begin to feel an unpleasant state and fall into a stupor. Affected bodies begin to melt like ice cream in the sunlight. The power of poison in the darts created with the help of the bride's magic is capable of causing fatal damage to all weak monsters and can cause critical damage to strong ones. Kajuro saw what was happening and was amazed at the monster bride's abilities. This ability can hit many targets and cause enormous damage to weak monsters. Some monsters managed to jump away from the attack and were shocked by such an attack and retreated in fear. The long-haired monster knew how to control and kill the enemy with the help of voodoo dolls. He was very angry that the bride came to his territory with a crowd of monsters and started a massacre. Realizing that she does not compromise on force, he takes out the doll to teach the beauty a lesson. Pointing the doll at the beautiful monster, the long-haired monster began to damage the doll and connect it with the bride. While everyone was fighting and not paying attention to him, he managed to create strong voodoo magic and prepared to harm the beauty. The small hay doll with magical properties was ready. The long-haired monster, using a thick needle, begins to pierce the doll in the heart area. After this, the monster immediately began to look at the bride, checking whether the voodoo magic had worked on her. The monster bride, covering her groom Kazuro, watched the fight and tried to control that no one would come into the back. Suddenly she feels severe pain in her chest and begins to fall exhausted. Kazuro saw the monster bride fall to the ground, and fearing for her condition, he ran up to her. Approaching, he begins to lift and press him to himself, asking if everything is okay. The girl, having received a severe wound, says that she received a wound, but not a fatal one. She looked at Kajuro, who was sincerely worried about her, and she was pleased. She could not allow him to be killed in front of her eyes, and began to fight the wound, using her defensive abilities. Kazuro said that he would not allow her to die, and would help. Having filled her heart with feelings for her beloved, the monster bride begins to use her most powerful magic, gradually rising above the ground. She was preparing to teach the long-haired monster a lesson and finish him off. The long-haired monster notices that the bride begins to use strong magic and responds in kind. Using his powerful abilities, wrapping himself in mana for protection and preparing for a counterattack. Having risen into the sky to meet the bride, a battle ensued between the two strongest monsters on the territory of the university. The ringing sounds and powerful blows looked like fireworks in the sky. Such a sight could be seen far away, but not enough to worry about the appearance of the head of security's people. Kajuro, watching the battle, decides to use his monsters to help his new friends and give his monsters an opportunity to have fun and increase their confidence level. Having summoned a monster with a chainsaw and a busty beauty to his aid, Kajuro, armed with a sword, began to attack the enemy monsters with enormous force. The monster with the chainsaw was glad to finally join the fight and cool down his desire to fight. In the heat of battle with monsters, Kazuro notices a monster preparing to cast a fire spell. Realizing that he has no protective magic, he pays attention to the vampire standing behind him and decides to ask him for help. The vampire, while fighting, feels how Kajuro begins to grab him by the back and asks him to cover him from the fire monster. The vampire, not understanding what is happening, turns around and leads the fireball approaching him. The vampire feels the fire covering him, and he experiences intense heat. Kazuro was hiding behind him and also experienced heat, but not direct contact. The vampire was a strong monster, and a weak fire attack would do nothing to him. After the fire attack, the vampire was not happy that Kajuro had set him up like that, and began to show his displeasure and yell at the guy. Kazuro felt ashamed, but understood that nothing would happen to the vampire after this. Scratching the back of his head, he began to apologize to the vampire and say that he had no choice. In the heat of battle with the long-haired monster, she noticed how the fireball was approaching the guy, but he managed to hide behind the vampire. Worried about the guy, she was distracted from the battle and revealed that she was worried about the guy in front of the enemy. The long-haired monster notices the bride's strong concern for the guy who killed his strongest servant and understands that he must attack the boy. Using his sharp and durable needles, he decided to attack the guy while the bride was distracted. The long-haired guy uses a throw boost and uses his needles to throw them at the guy. The monster bride manages to notice that the attack is on the guy, and using her abilities, tries to save the boy. Kajuro was fighting monsters and had no idea that sharp needles were flying at him at great speed. Suddenly, a huge, beautiful flower appears in front of his head and takes the blow of the long-haired monster. The long-haired monster was puzzled by the fact that all his attacks were successfully repulsed. Angered, he uses a power-up strike with a fast sorcery technique and decides to strike the monster bride. Before she can dodge the blow, the bride takes a very strong blow, which takes her out of the fight for a short time. A strong blow to the stomach can stun any monster. Kazuro notices that the fight is not going in favor of the monster bride and decides to help her. After telling his buxom beauty to use stunning magic on the long-haired monster, Kajuro is worried but hopes to help. Using his zither, waves of deafening notes began to fly towards the enemy. The long-haired monster suddenly freezes, receiving strong sound waves that take him out of the fight for a short time and block his abilities. The monster fights with such force, but cannot win, and any attempts are even. The monster bride took advantage of the moment and pulled the needles out of herself, experiencing severe pain. She began to try to quickly heal her wounds and figure out how to attack the long-haired monster so that he would not have time to defend himself. Kojuro did not count on the bride's intervention and decided to finish the fight himself by asking your chainsaw monster for help. The monster with the saw readily agreed and launched Kojuro at the long-haired monster. Kojuro was flying with his sword and wanted to quickly kill the monster. Flying up to the monster, the boy begins to use his sword and fill it with powerful force to strike. The long-haired monster slowly begins to come to his senses and notices the boy's approach. He begins to try to escape from the stun and block the guy's attack. The sword was already approaching the monster's body and began to intensify its glow, showing its growing strength. The long-haired monster doubted that the boy would have the strength to break through his protective magic and smiled nervously, hoping to survive. The unexpected enormous power of the blow knocked the long-haired monster to the ground. A huge flash from the impact lit up the entire sky within a radius of several kilometers. From such power, all the monsters froze around and stopped the fight, realizing that it was their leader flying to the ground. Kojuro landed after the blow next to the remains of the body of the long-haired monster and stood proudly, holding a sword in his hands. The mighty monster was dying, exuding its power as if fiery tongues of flame were coming out of it. Among the remains lay the monster's soul stone. The monster of the bride rose above the monsters of the enemy and invited them to surrender in an amicable way. Otherwise, they would be killed without a shadow of a doubt. The monsters looked at the remains of their leader and realized that they had no choice if they wanted to live on. The bride, with her proud and threatening appearance, showed that only she is worthy to rule this place and serve her as a great honor for the monsters. If they agree to become her servants, they must bow and kneel in praise of her. Monsters, feeling her power and realizing that they must do everything she says, otherwise they will set their minions to kill them, or the guy with the sword who killed their leader. All the monsters knelt down and began to bow to the monster bride and show her their devotion. The girl was very glad that she was finally able to put an end to the long-haired monster thanks to her brave hubby and rejoiced. By the way, about hubby, the bride began to turn her head in search of her beloved and wanted to quickly fall into his arms and his tender arms. Realizing that he had helped her so much, she had no doubt that he was a worthy husband for such a beauty as a monster bride. Noticing that Kojuro was near the remains of the long-haired monster and was collecting something in admiration, she flew towards him. Kojuro, seeing how many monster stones were on the ground after the battle, immediately began to fill his pockets and rejoice that he could sell them profitably. And the stone of the long-haired monster was different from the others, being larger in size and purple in color, probably very valuable, Kojuro thought. Rejoicing at so many treasures and figuring out what to spend the money for them on, he didn't think about anything. The bride, flying up to the guy, began to hug the guy from the back with gentle movements of her hands and, a little embarrassed, thanked him for his help. Hugging him tightly and snuggling as close as possible, she was happy with him and felt strong feelings. Kojuro, on the contrary, wanted to quickly unhook from her and quickly return to the location of the dorm, since tomorrow there are classes. He understood that there could be no love relationship between a man and a monster, and tried with all his might to explain this to his bride. The girl, when she heard the boy say this, began to say vulgar things, that the boy simply did not understand what he was giving up, and every time he refused to continue the evening, he only fell more in love with himself. Kojuro is once again convinced that girls are very strange and do not understand when they are rejected. Kojuro looked at the bride, embarrassed by her words, and understood that such a beauty clearly deserved the best, but not with a person. Her appearance was stunning and attracted everyone, but fate was against it. Kojuro said that it was time for him to return to the dorm since it was already late, and he had achieved his goal of fighting the strongest monster on the university grounds. The bride, having met his desire, did not stop, but saw him off, waving her hand and waiting for a quick meeting with her beloved. Meanwhile, 3 exchange students sat behind a ridge of bushes and watched what was happening. They were greatly frightened when they saw a huge fight between crowds of monsters and Kojuro taking the fight. Fen was so surprised that he didn't know what to say to the others. The only thing that came to his mind was to tell Yui to call his father and warn him about Kojuro's abilities. Yui was also frightened by what she saw and agreed with Fen's words that it was necessary to warn the head of the absorbers. Remembering the incident at the hospital, she didn't really want to call her dad and still couldn't see or talk to him, so she decided to write a message. Tsuyuki asked why she couldn't just call and tell it like it was, to which Yui replied that there were too many monsters around, and they could be heard. Trying not to reveal her condition, Yui thought that this would be better than telling what she saw in the hospital. Having received a message from his daughter, the head of the Kento absorbers urgently convened a meeting and began to bring all employees up to date. Nada had to urgently come up with something and do something with this guy, otherwise he poses a threat to his existence. It has not yet been possible to find out who his family is, but then we need to grab the boy and wait for them to appear, said the head of Kento. Kento began to warn his employees that the boy already owned 4 high-ranking monsters and was only becoming more dangerous. We found information in school records that he was only able to summon 1/2 ghost and no more. And now he already has 4 high ranks. Something else is clearly involved here. Either he hid information about himself, or he has a very rare ability to increase the possibility of absorbing monsters, the head of Kento nervously said. The director of the Mauchi Supreme Devourers University, Lin, was very worried about this problem because his children were in danger, and if they gave themselves away, they would pay with their lives. He wanted to ask Kento to call off the undercover students and deal with Kojuro to his people. Kento replied that as long as he did not do this, it might cause suspicion, and added that there was no need to worry about them. They were capable of taking care of themselves. Director Lin, having calmed down a little, begins to ask the head, "What options will there be for capturing Kojuro then?" Kento, from his long experience of serving as the head of the absorbers and in the ranks of ordinary soldiers, remembers that for such strong opponents it is necessary to carry out an ambush on a huge scale with the participation of outsiders in order to remove suspicion from what is happening. Director Lin remembered that there would soon be a competition between universities to catch dangerous monsters in a closed city. This is a very suitable place to ambush and capture the guy. There won't be many people there, and the chances are quite high. Chief Kento agreed with Director Lin and thanked him for the great idea. Meanwhile, at the time of the monster battle, the director of the cell was on the street and noticed bright flashes from the battle. He immediately realized that it was Kojuro. He would not confuse such strong sword magic with anything, pulling his hand with a lit cigarette to his mouth. Feeling severe pain in his lip from the charred part of the cigarette, Director Soda cried out in pain and shed a tear. Without realizing it, he decided to smoke a cigarette on the wrong side and was caught by his carelessness. The awkward situation could have seriously damaged the respect for the director, but it's good that no one saw it. We are transported to the moment when Kojuro has already arrived in his room and is getting ready for bed. Climbing onto the second tier of the bed, he remembered that Khan had shown how to increase his strength with the help of a monster stone, and decided to try it. Taking the lotus position, he began to meditate, trying to channel the energy of the stone into his body. After several minutes of meditation, the stone began to emit a strong purple glow, and power began to flow out of the stone into Kojuro's body. A state of calm and balance in the soul helps to quickly absorb the powers of the stone and increase the level of mana and strength in the guy's body. Having absorbed all the power from the stone, Kojuro woke up and, holding the stone in his hand, was glad that Han's words were true and helped raise all the characteristics and restore his condition. This is great advice that will help you recover faster after fighting monsters, Kojuro thought. Feeling much better, Kojuro decided to go to bed and get some sleep while he could. After so many events that happened that day, I really needed to rest and gain strength and vigor for the upcoming couples. Classes began as usual, and soon, Director Sota received information that a competition between universities to catch monsters would soon be held. The university must nominate groups of students to fight, and the winner will be named based on the results. After the announcement, there was a buzz in the class, and everyone was heatedly discussing who would go and exactly how many students should take part. Some wondered why the first year was also allowed to compete. Director Sota began to calm everyone down and say that no one would force anyone. The competition is exclusively for those interested. Kazuro heard such a great chance to show himself and level up, as well as collect a large number of stones, that he decided to try his hand. He recalled how during the exam he collected a whole bunch of treasures, and the money from what he sold on the black market still hasn't run out. Director Sota, seeing many interested parties, decided to clarify that they would have to act in groups. It would be very dangerous alone, and none of the participating universities would agree to allow one participant to do this. Kazuro, hearing such a prohibition, thought a little. Kajuro decided to invite Han to go with him to the competition. Kajuro began to explain that this was a great chance to prove himself and secure his future. Realizing that Han was not interested in money, Kajuro decided to lure him with a decent career ladder and a glorious future. Khan agreed, but said that it wouldn't be easy for the two of them either. Kajuro decides to invite his friend Po to the team so that he can improve his skills and be more useful. The fat man sat and played on the phone and didn't care about the competition, since he himself understood that he was weak and had no business even getting into it. Kazuro thought about how to lure his friend to participate in the competition. He is too cowardly and has a weak monster. But Kazuro knew his friend's weaknesses and decided to use a cunning method. Taking out his phone, Kajuro said that he had Sarah's number and could give it to the fat man if he went to the competition with them. The fat man was wearing headphones, but he heard the name of his beautiful Sarah clearly and turned his attention to Kazuro. Glad that Kajuro had Sarah's number, Po reached for his phone to take the number. Kazuro understood that the fat man would definitely want the number and would be ready for anything. Po began to beg Kazuro to give Sarah's number, and he would do whatever he asked, but he was afraid to take part in the competition, since he was very weak. Kajuro replies that Po will be able to increase his skill level and become stronger. Kajuro encourages Po and says that if they win, then Sarah herself will come up to Po and greet him. Po thought about it and was a little scared that he would have to risk his life again, but wanting Sarah's praise was probably worth it. The guys agreed with Kazuro, but Po was still afraid that he was too weak and might die. Kajuro sat and listened to the instructions of Director Sota and was ready for battle. The rest of the children in the class did not want to participate, realizing their abilities. After classes, Kajuro decided to come to the infirmary and check on Hanami. Sitting down on a chair next to her, he began to peel the apple with a knife. He wanted to tell her about the competition in which he wanted to take part with his classmates. Having finished peeling the apple, Kazuro gives Hanami an apple so that she can eat some vitamins and get better faster. Telling her about new competitions between universities, that they will be able to earn a lot and pay for her mother's treatment. Biting an apple, she says that she won't be able to do much since she is still very weak. Kajuro takes the apple and agrees not to force her to eat it. Smiling, he takes the apple and continues to say that he is not interested in winning, but only in the opportunity to collect as many stones as possible or find jewelry to sell on the black market and give to her. Hanami says that she doesn't like the fact that Kajuro is willing to risk so much for her. She expresses her concern and invites him to refuse, and she can find the money for treatment herself. If something happens to him, she will not forgive herself. Kajuro listens that Hanami is not happy that he wants to participate in the competition, and unknowingly begins to eat the apple after Hanami, without thinking that she was poisoned by the bite of Director Lin's wolf monster. Hanami notices that Kajuro started eating the apple and shows his displeasure, because there was her drool. Kazuro said that he was not disgusted and only began to bite and smack harder, eating the apple with pleasure. He smiled and finished the apple, saying that the apple tasted even better after her. The awkward compliment gave rise to a short silence and a strange situation. Hanami was a little surprised and didn't know how to tell Kajuro something important. Hanami, lying in her bed, said that the boy did not understand that she was poisoned, and drool on an apple could transmit poison. Kazuro, throwing the stupidity out of his head, realized that he could have made a mistake and would be poisoned by the same poison. He was very frightened and turned pale, covered in cold sweat. Kajuro immediately grabbed his stomach and began to think that now he would feel ill and would not be able to participate in the competition. Hanami starts laughing at the boy and teasing him with the words that now they will lie in the same room and eat apples. While Kajuro was visiting Hanami and entertaining him, Yui watched him and noticed that that girl looked a lot like her. Remembering how her father beat the woman in the hospital, who is the girl's mother, Yui felt awkward and wanted to talk about everything. Yui was sure that she and Hanami had something more in common than their acquaintance with Kazuro. She felt that she definitely didn't know everything about her father's life, and when she caught him beating that woman in the hospital, she was finally convinced that he was clearly hiding a lot. After pleasant conversations and a good time with Hanami, Kajuro returned to his room and decided to discuss plans for the competition. Po approached Kajuro and asked him to give him Sarah's number while they got ready, and Han sat in the lotus position and rubbed his maple, bringing it into perfect condition. Kazuro folded the card in half and hit Po on the head with the words that he needed to think about how to win the competition and draw up an action plan for an additional prize. When I got hit on the head, I was a little surprised, and when I heard about additional plans for the competition, I became interested in what Kazuro had come up with. Han sat further and cleaned his sword, and did not attach importance to Kazuro's words, but listened carefully. Showing on the map an interesting place in an abandoned city where they could look for supplies for the future, he began to tell them that there was an opportunity to clean out the bank and divide everything equally. Kazuro told the guys that he plans to look for money in the bank, hoping that there is still money there in order to pay for the treatment of his friend's mother. Po and Han, having heard Kazuro's words, said that they would help in clearing the bank and they didn't need anything. Po said that he would help, but he urgently needed Sarah's number. He wanted to send her an interesting photo. Kazuro, hearing Po, began to suspect that after that photo, Po would have problems with Sarah, and he refused, saying that only after the competition and nothing else. It's time for the University Monster Catching Competition. All students gathered in a closed area in front of the entrance to the abandoned city. In addition to the participants, there were rescue vehicles and military vehicles on the territory, so that in case of an unforeseen situation they could intervene and eliminate the threat. Among the many children from different universities, Po notices that among the crowd are his classmates, exchange students from the Maochi Supreme Devourers University U, and brother Fen and sister Suyuki. They also took part in the competition, and this made Po a little tense, since Kajuro told him that they could not be trusted. Gathered near the performance area, Director Lin came onto the stage and welcomed everyone to take part in the university competition for the title of Best University of the Year. The director began to tell them what awaited them in the closed city and their upcoming goals, for victory which we will have to work hard for. Some of the participants were scared that they would have to fight monsters, but they came here willingly, wanting to succeed and become stronger. But Director Lin's words only reminded that there are a lot of dangers in the city, and you need to be very cold-blooded and strong to win. Kazuro, listening to Director Lin's loud statements about all the obstacles that await them, heard that some participants began to change their minds about taking part in the competition and wanted to go back home. They were filled with fear for their own lives, and the decision for which they came here was in vain. Director Lin, after telling them what awaited them all in the closed city, decided to ask one last time if there were anyone who wanted to refuse to take part in such a dangerous competition. He wanted to weed out all sorts of weaklings as much as possible, so that the competition would be as dangerous as possible. Some began to raise their hand, trembling in fear. One of the participants refused to take part, thereby exposing his classmates. He only wanted to survive, and his friend dragged him here, but he himself did not want to risk his life. His bandmate attacked him, grabbing his t-shirt and starting to shout that he was a coward and was only ruining everything. He is already very weak at the university and could improve his skills by taking part in such an important competition between universities, but now they will all be expelled if the group is not complete. The boy was scared and did not know that because of his cowardice, the whole group would suffer. Suddenly, they are pushed aside by the invisible forces of Director Lin's abilities. A statement that before the competition they must not injure themselves or anyone in the squad. The punishment would be exclusion from the competition, Director Lin said. Having dropped out of the competition, the participants begin to leave the closed area and the safe zone point of the abandoned city. They were very upset that this happened, but at least they would not die because of their stupidity in thinking that they could cope with strong monsters. Director Lin looked after the weak children and stood near the entrance watching the others. He saw Kajuro with some guys and thought that everything would work out and they would be able to catch the boy without attracting attention and deal with his comrades, risking an accident and death at the hands of monsters. Finally, the start of the competition was announced, and large armored doors began to open in front of the guys, letting them into the abandoned city. Most of the participants proudly began to walk towards the door, as did our heroes Kajuro and his comrades. Behind the open gates, only destruction awaited everyone. Human skeletons and remains, and many dangers at every corner. Kazuro and his comrades went inside and passing by the remains of last year's participants, were a little scared. After walking a few meters, Kazuro stopped to look where they should go and assess the situation. Khan watched what was happening on the left and tried to remember which of the participants went in that direction. Po watched from the right and remembered how much went to the right. He was scared and felt fear from every dark corner of this abandoned city. Most of the buildings were covered with corrosion, began to be overgrown with moss and covered with dirt. From long periods of inactivity and the influence of weather, the buildings could collapse from any movement. No human has set foot in it for more than 10 years. The whole city was filled with monsters. Such a place was ideal for holding such a dangerous competition. The guys walked along the old open street and looked at the old city. On some buildings, there were old signs that could be used to navigate. Kajuro took out a map to make sure they were going in the right direction. He wanted to quickly find a suitable road and get away from the prying eyes of other participants, who were also still following the main road and were afraid to turn into a dark alley. Trying to see where they needed to go on the map under the light of the moon, he came across one place on the map where they could look and stay there until the right moment. It should be safe and not far from the bank where they are going. Po stops the guys, saying that while passing by a tall building, he saw something strange there, and suggested that monsters could hide in buildings and only come out when they see lonely targets in order to surprise and kill. Han, listening to Po's story, was not surprised and knew that he could not be approached unnoticed. Kazuro, looking up from the map, was captivated by Po's opinion and agreed that this could be so. Po noticed that the guys in front of them were walking from the very beginning and weren't turning anywhere. Maybe they knew something, Po said. Kazuro was completely indifferent to the presence of other participants and replied that if so, they would clear the way for them from the monsters. Among the three guys, there was a girl in a military suit. They approached a small building with a sign about car repair. Perhaps they wanted to go to the service to see if there were monsters there so they could fight them. They were very quiet and calmly observing their surroundings. Kajuro said that if they plan to go where he is, then Nada will stop them and prevent them from taking all the money from the bank before them. Kajuro didn't want to let anyone stop him from saving Hanami's mother. He was very serious and did not intend to lose. Noticing that Kazuro was right, and the guys began to enter the building with a sign on the wall of the car service and climb the stairs to the top. Kazuro calmed down, and the guys continued to walk to the given point on the map, simultaneously looking at the group of guys entering the building. Having reached the next alley, Kazuro looked out to make sure there were no obstacles or troubles. Po also decided to look out, and trying not to shake with fear and maintain composure, looked to see if there were any monsters there. Kazuro notices a suitable house where they can stay. It was an old abandoned small house surrounded by a fence. Po and Han began to approach him, looking around a little and making sure he was safe. The doors were broken, and there was a lot of dirt and cobwebs inside from the lack of people. Kajuro smiled and said that this was a suitable place to spend the night. Khan went inside and did not show any emotions. He just looked around and assessed the situation. Po tensely entered the building, afraid that they would sleep in a house without doors and be vulnerable. Khan, having found a good place, decided to wipe it down so that he could sit down and not get his clothes dirty. It was a little unexpected for Kazuro that such a quiet man and a master of the sword was so neat and always carried a rag with him. Having wiped the place for himself, Khan wanted to sit down and start checking his blade, but without having time to do anything, he sat down on a clean place. Po, and with great zeal, began to say that it was time for them to have a snack and fill their bellies before bed, not paying attention to Han's surprised and slightly angry face. Kazuro took out crackers from their small supply of food and began to slowly enjoy eating one. Food was scarce, and they had to save money, so there was no time to waste. The competition lasts a day, and the first thing each group needs to do is find shelter for the night. Kazuro gave one cracker to Han, saying that he had to save money and would have to starve a little. Khan agrees, realizing that with large supplies, they would have to go slower and come under attack from monsters. Meanwhile, Po greedily ate several crackers at once, not thinking about the consequences. He just wanted to eat and eat. And also Sarah's number. Kajuro began to reprimand Po that he was eating all their food and they would be weak when attacked by the monster and would not be able to cope because of such a glutton. While the guys were talking about Po's bad deed, that he immediately decided to gobble up all their supplies, some guy comes into their house. Kazuro and Han, hearing footsteps, turn their attention to the entrance and notice it. They were a little worried, but remained where they were. It was a guy from the group that entered the building with a sign for a car service. He came to them with 2 large pieces of meat and, smiling, offered to take them, since they caught a deer in this city and cut up its carcass. And there was quite a lot of meat, and so as not to waste, they decided to share it. Kajuro and Han stood behind Po and were surprised by such generosity from a potential enemy and began to suspect that something was wrong. Po was so hungry that he began to approach the boy with the meat, rubbing the back of his head and asking what they wanted for such a delicious piece of meat. The boy replies that it is a gift and he doesn't need anything. He just didn't want the meat to go to waste. Po was already reaching for large and juicy pieces of meat with the desire to quickly devour them. Kazuro, sensing some kind of catch, decides to stop Po from taking the meat and manages to stop him. Kazuro is still sure that no one will simply give food as a gift in such competitions between university participants. Kazuro thanks the boy for coming to treat them to such delicious pieces of meat, but he doesn't quite understand how an ordinary animal like a deer could survive in an abandoned city with a lot of monsters. But when I turned my head, I also suspected something was wrong. Khan began to come up and say that on the way he only saw ravens that flew above them, but he didn't see any other animals. And it was really strange. The guys were hungry but not so stupid as to believe some unfamiliar guy that he would bring large and juicy pieces of meat to the opposing group for no reason at all. The boy with the meat, realizing that he had to somehow get out, says that there is a zoo nearby, and the deer was behind the fence. There was a lot of grass around, and that's why he survived, and regular rains in this area filled the drinking bowl and did not allow the animal to die. There were several weak monsters around the cage that wanted to taste the deer, but they couldn't get inside. Kazuro, listening to all this nonsense, decides to play along with the guy and agrees to find out what all this nada is for, and at the same time make sure that this is a setup and this is not deer meat. If this is a setup, then perhaps other members of the group can wait for the right moment and attack. Kazuro agrees with great pleasure and, pretending to believe it, takes a bunch of 2 juicy pieces of meat from the guy. The boy gives the meat away with great pleasure and thinks that he managed to deceive the guys. Kazuro, remembering that Han said that his sword can determine the monster's abilities, thinks that the meat is not deer after all and they will find out the truth. Having given the meat, the boy got ready to leave through the broken doors of the house and waved to the guys, smiling. Such a friendly guy in such an abandoned place was clearly suspicious, and Kajuro understood it. After leaving, Kajuro asked Han to check the meat for any suspicious substances. Placing the bundle on the table, Kajuro tells Han to act. Po looked at the meat and salivated with desire to taste the tender and juicy meat. Khan pierces the meat with his blade and Po doesn't like it, causing him to raise cries of misunderstanding. Kazuro stops the screams by saying that this is how it should be, and they must make sure that the meat is safe and can be eaten. Having cooled down a little, he begins to understand Kajuro's idea and why he so kindly agreed to take the meat after he himself had forbidden it. Khan took out his blade from the pierced pieces of meat and began to look at the blade. When it changes color and begins to give off an unpleasant odor, he can determine what kind of animal or monster the meat is. It takes some time, but the answer will be soon, and the guys need to wait a little. Meanwhile, Po can no longer control his hunger and, drooling, greedily looks at the meat and reaches out to devour it. He is so stupid that his brain turns off at the sight of food and his patience disappears. Khan finally realized whose piece of meat it was, and the information was unpleasant for the guys. The meat was a monster capable of causing severe paralysis and sleepiness. After eating such meat, they would never wake up again. After hearing Hana's words, he was very upset and hungry. He understood that Kajuro was right and no one could be trusted in this abandoned city. Kazuro stood with his head bowed and realized that the boy had hardly gone far and would wait for the poison to take effect in order to inform his comrades in the group. Kazuro invites his comrades to pretend that they have eaten meat and go to bed, simultaneously preparing for an attack. Kazuro asked Han to throw the meat somewhere, and Po to make sounds of pain and show concern about the condition. If that boy is nearby, he will hear and tell his friends. Then we will attack them if they appear. Po began to make sounds of regret and pain from meat poisoning. The other guys also tried to pretend that they felt bad. The boy who brought the meat heard that they bought and ate the meat. He was nearby and realized that he had succeeded in deceiving those three and poisoning them. The insidious plan to eliminate the competition participants worked. Even no one will understand who did it, since the monster's meat could be eaten at any time. The boy was sure that now no one would stop them from finding a high-ranking monster in this area and killing it, delivering the stone to the exit and winning. The guys pretended that they had gone to bed and tried to act convincing. Po, after so much loud snoring, suddenly fell asleep for real. Having cleaned the floor before bed and laid down their sleeping bears, the guys rested on the wooden floor listening to their surroundings. Suddenly, they heard loud words arranged in rhyme. At first, they did not understand what was happening and thought that it was the group that poisoned them that decided to attack in this way, accompanying the attack with poetry. But this was not so. Beautifully composed words came from the theater stage located nearby. Two monsters appeared on the theater stage and played the play, not paying attention to the fact that there were no spectators or anyone at all. Their playing was quite loud and could be heard throughout the entire area in that area. The ghost woman was dressed in a beautiful and ancient robe made of silk and had long sleeves. She had a short hairstyle on her head, decorated with red stones and designs. Her eyes glowed and evoked fear from the mysterious monster. The stage comrade looked like an ancient warrior in golden armor skillfully operating a naginata. They played a scene together in the theater and were happy on stage. Their story of a warrior in love and the daughter of a ruler was played every evening in an abandoned city. Seeing through the window that two monsters appeared on stage and were performing a play, Kazuro was a little surprised. He had never seen anything like this, and thought that such monsters were clearly different from ordinary low-ranking ones. Khan complimented Kazuro's guesses by saying that he felt a strong swordsman's aura from one of the monsters, and they were definitely strong. Meanwhile, another group of students with a boy who tried to poison Kazuro and his comrades began to invite their roommate to go together and fight the monsters. Since they were of high rank and by winning, it would be possible to deliver their stones to the gate and win the competition between universities. The girl in a military suit agreed to attack the monsters on stage and began to summon her monster, which looked like it was made of mud and was melting before our eyes. Their attitude was serious, and they were preparing to attack the monsters on stage, interrupting the performance. While Kazuro and Han were discussing their next steps, Po began to wake up after some girls' loud vocal performances. Yawning, he asked the guys what was going on and where were they going. Kajuro looked at Po and said it was time for them to seize the moment. He looked at Po and said that after trying to kill them and hearing that strong monsters had appeared on stage, Kajuro suggested going to the stage and watching the show without interfering with the fight. If possible, and most importantly, do not show fear, then they will not be touched for now. On the stage, a girl in the national attire of the old era sang a song about love for her warrior groom, fighting with other countries and warriors. Kazuro and his comrades came to the stage and began to listen and encourage the monsters to perform well. Po tried not to show that he was scared and sat quietly on the bench. Khan cautiously approached Po to sit next to him. Only Kajuro did not hesitate to express his emotions and loudly applauded and praised the theater actress. A girl from the squad saw that 3 guys came to watch the concert and decided that the meat had a very strange effect on them, and, being poisoned, they were able to come to the concert. Probably, the poison of the meat and the song of the monster act on them like a trance and attract them to themselves, the girl in military uniform thought. She decided that the monsters would be distracted by the guys and ordered her comrades to attack the girl on the stage and quickly kill her. Having waited for the right moment, they ran towards the stage, and preparing for battle, they were confident of victory.